Starvation in Gaza. For the first time, the White House offers recognition and help, but hangs a trade threat over Canada for supporting a Palestinian state. Members of Congress denied entry to an ICE facility. The government says there's nothing to see. But Congressman Glenn Ivey will join us to say he suspects inhumane treatment behind closed doors. Words of outrage. Family members of an Epstein victim are shocked by President Trump's recent description of things and call Ghislaine Maxwell a monster. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. I welcome you to the Takeout. How do you recognize something that doesn't exist? How does something exist without being recognized? A Palestinian state does not exist. Yet France, Britain, and Canada say they intend to recognize one in September. Starvation bordering on famine has existed in Gaza for months, yet that remains unrecognized by the Israeli government and was, until very recently, not much recognized by the White House. But the plight of civilians in Gaza who die by the dozens daily from malnutrition or from wounds suffered trying to obtain what little food that does trickle into the enclave has become too pronounced, too harrowing to ignore. It must, therefore, be recognized. Today, President Trump's top diplomatic envoy, Steve Witkoff, met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Witkoff will travel to Gaza tomorrow, a first for him. The White House says it will release $30 million in aid to Gaza. This is a recognition that suffering is real, and it is also a step away from Israel's lament that its hands are tied by the brutal influence of Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is a problem. The terrorist group still runs much of what's left of Gaza, and its indifference to civilians there has become so obvious that for the first time, the 22-nation Arab League this week condemned its murderous October 7th assault on Israel and called for Hamas to disarm. This Arab League gesture imagines a post-Hamas reality for Gaza and the prospect, however dim, of a Palestinian state that includes it and the West Bank. Palestinian statehood, even in its current mirage-like status, has found its way, believe it or not, into trade talks with the United States. President Trump says it's getting in the way of conversations with Canada. There was lots of trade news to sift today as tomorrow's deadline for new deals approaches. Kelly O'Grady is standing by to help us with all of that. But we begin with Nancy Cordes at the White House. Nancy, this was a significant day in the conversation in this White House about what's going on in Gaza and what it intends to do about it and the eyeballs it wants to have on it.
It was indeed, Major, because you now have the president's special envoy to the region, Steve Witkoff, and the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, planning to actually go into Gaza tomorrow and to see the conditions there for themselves. Now, it's not clear whether they are going to have free reign to go wherever they want, or whether they will basically be led through specific areas by the Israelis. But nevertheless, it is an indication that there is a growing concern here within the White House about the conditions, the humanitarian conditions in Gaza. Also, as you mentioned, this $30 million that the president has previously announced is now going to be released, and it's going to be given, the White House says, to a somewhat controversial, frankly, U.S.-Israeli operation that is delivering food and other aid into Gaza. International observers would like that money to go to an international aid organization. They argue that that this U.S.-Israeli operation is not getting the food to where it needs to go. But nevertheless, it is a sign that this president, who has talked from time to time, Major, about the concerns that he has about the Palestinian people in Gaza, has said that he wants to push the Israeli prime minister to do more, now might be ready to put his money where his mouth is on that front.
And it's even complicating our trade conversations, is it not?
It is, especially because you've got countries like Canada and France going much further than the White House would be comfortable by saying that they are ready to declare Gaza a state, to declare Palestinian statehood. The president wasn't happy with that. He lashed out at Canada in a Truth Social post earlier today. He said that that complicates U.S. trade negotiations with Canada. Unclear what one might have to do with the other, aside from the fact that it is something on which he disagrees with the Canadian Prime Minister. But he has been in the Oval Office talking about an unrelated event, Major, and a few minutes ago he was asked if that's a deal breaker when it comes to U.S. trade talks with Canada on the eve of this August 1st deadline. And he said, no, it's not a deal breaker, but he would like to see Canada take a different course.
Nancy Cordes on the North Lawn of the White House. As always, thank you so very much. William F. Wexler joins me now. He's the Senior Director of Middle East Programs at the Atlantic Council. William, it's great to have you with us. You heard my introduction, laying out things as they are. Is this something that we should regard as a significant step by the White House and maybe one that's away from the Netanyahu government, or do you still see them very tightly aligned on what is or isn't happening to civilians in Gaza?
I think that President Trump has a decision to make about how aligned he's going to be with Prime Minister Netanyahu's policies. You've seen changes in just the last couple of days from President Trump saying that the starvation was real and calling out Israel's government for these actions, to today calling out Hamas for its actions that contribute, obviously, to the situation. President Trump started this dynamic, unfortunately, with a decision to call for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza some months ago. There are
talking about moving all the Palestinians out
and creating a new Riviera in Gaza. Unfortunately, some of the most dangerous voices inside of Israel took him up on that offer. And that's
gave them a kind of a permission structure.
Exactly. And that's contributed to the decisions that Israel has made.
And hardened that hard-right faction within the Netanyahu coalition.
It is. And the center of gravity for much of this war is actually not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, but it's in the cabinet meeting room in Jerusalem. Now, President Trump is absolutely right in that the fastest way to end the war is for Hamas to agree to give up the hostages and to commit to a ceasefire and release its grip on Gaza. That has always been the desired outcome here. So he's absolutely right about that. But it's also the case that Israel made a decision starting back in March to restart the war after the ceasefire and intentionally to restrict aid. The idea was unfortunately a bad strategy. The idea that people had in Israel was that there would be more pressure on Hamas from the starving people and the terrible situations that we see in Gaza than there is on Israel. And the reality is that the leaders of Hamas don't care about the Palestinian people. And at the end of the day, based on pressure from the rest of the world, most likely Israel is going to care more.
Is it significant that I noted the Arab League denunciation of the October 7th assault and the call for Hamas to disarm? It seems to me that that's been a long time coming and is a signal that those in the region, not Israel, are seeing a time when Hamas is no longer running Gaza.
That is the only long-term solution here. The overall rejectionist narrative, the overall resistance narrative that has driven Hamas and other entities inside the Palestinian community has to come to grips after 80 years of the existence of Israel. And until that happens, there's not likely to be a lasting solution to that. But if that happens, Israel has to be in a position to accept that reality and finally move back towards the two-state solution, which is the only lasting continuing security situation for both peoples.
And probably the Israeli government looks at that Arab League statement as something of a note of progress.
It should. It should indeed. It should have come earlier.
Of course.
It would have been better if the Arab countries would have had a common voice asking, demanding Hamas to put down their weapons, release the hostages, and for their leadership to leave, just like the PLO left Lebanon many decades ago. That's what actually the Palestinian Authority leadership actually has called for some time ago. So it's nice that we're seeing the Arab League start to take steps in this direction. But it's also understandable. It's very difficult for them when their people see daily, hourly images on television, on social media of suffering of Palestinians.
Not to first blame the Israelis and not Hamas, but clearly there is complicity, if not bloody fingerprints, for Hamas all over this situation.
Hamas is the one that started the war on October 7th. I landed in Israel the morning of October 7th when that happened, and I landed to see an Israel that had fundamentally changed. And Israel is still that country that has fundamentally changed.
And remains traumatized politically and otherwise.
Absolutely.
William Lexer, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Major.
President Trump will impose hefty tariffs tomorrow on dozens of countries if they have not yet reached a framework trade understanding with the United States. This morning, the president announced, this was interesting, on social media that the U.S. and Mexico being our top trading partner, have agreed to extend their current deal for 90 days while trade talks continue. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. So happy to see you, Kelly. Rescue me from my confusion if you can, please.
I know. I thought that August 1st deadline was firm, but it does.
Didn't the president just say that 3 days ago?
That's a negotiation tactic, though. You know, hat tip to always keeping the goalposts moving. That is what you do in a good negotiation. That being said, look, I think the fact that there is an extension with Mexico, that is a win for businesses that are importing goods, that are selling into that. It's a 25% tariff because of fentanyl coming across the border, the 25% sector tariff for autos, as well as the 50% tariff for aluminum, copper, as well as steel. I will note, though, and this is really important, there is that existing USMCA trade agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada that was negotiated under the president's first term. It replaced NAFTA. And so these tariffs don't apply to any of the goods that are protected within that agreement. That, of course, is up for renegotiation in 2026. So it does seem like negotiations are sort of humming along between Mexico and the U.S., but my eye is on that next year. I think this is sort of designed to put pressure ahead of that renegotiation of the larger trade agreement.
And what about Canada? Canada's up for, this thing has to be closed by tomorrow.
That's right. Or we could see tariffs go up. Nancy, I think, put sort of all of the context into whether they're going to recognize the Palestine as a state or not. That's complicating matters. But the president has really hammered home that Canada has treated the U.S. badly when it comes to those non-tariff barriers, that they support certain industries like the dairy industry within Canada. But that's going to be a really big one when you think about the auto industry and just how the supply chain across some of our major auto companies that this earnings season have already admitted they're taking major hits to their bottom line because of these tariffs.
Yesterday on this program, Peter Navarro, top trade advisor to the president, talked about lumber in Canada. We're going to talk to the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan, shortly on this program about the implications for Canadian tariffs and the automakers in Detroit. There's a lot spinning around the Canada conversation presently.
Yeah, that's right. And you think about lumber specifically, we have a housing crisis. We need to build more. All of those things, whether it's steel, aluminum, lumber, things that we get from Canada, that has trickle-down effects to businesses and consumers like you and me as we try and figure out that problem.
Kelly O'Grady, always hit it out of the park every single time, and I thank you. Still to come. According to officials, it's just ICE offices, but one senator calls it evil, persisting in darkness. Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey was among those denied access. We'll ask him what he fears is happening to immigrant detainees inside this building. Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan left the Democratic Party to run for governor as an independent. He's raising money and shaking up Michigan politics and will join us tonight.
They weren't lodged against every military voter statewide. It was military voters in 4 heavily Democratic counties.
North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs on the months-long legal fight over her election and how it jeopardized votes cast in North Carolina and by service members overseas. All that ahead on The Takeout. Welcome back. In a lot of places in this country, there's kind of a tug of war going on over access to where ICE facilities are being used, even on a temporary basis, to hold detainees. There was something that happened here locally this week. Several Maryland congressional Democrats were denied access to an Immigration and Customs Enforcement building in Baltimore. The lawmakers say they were there to investigate concerns about reports of inhumane conditions inside this particular facility. Now, ICE said they denied access because it's not a detention facility, it's just an office where immigrants are held on a temporary basis. Well, Maryland Democratic Congressman Glenn Ivey was one of those Democrats barred from entry, and he joins us here in the Conversation Corner. Congressman, explain to my audience what happened, what are your underlying concerns, and if you believe the administration has been truthful in its representation to you and other Democrats trying to gain access.
Well, a group of us that ended up being 2 of the state's senators and 4 of the members of Congress sent a letter to Homeland Security about 7 days before we went to visit.
Which is what they now require, notice ahead of time.
Yeah, well, we actually aren't required to give notice ahead of time.
No, but they are setting that as
But we sent the notice anyway,
right,
just to
clarify your intent and to let them know.
Just to be polite, basically, try and avoid this kind of scenario. They received the letter, and they knew they had it. And we brought it along with us when we came in any event. But when we came there and went into the building, we went up to the 6th floor, which is where they took us, but wouldn't let us get beyond the external door. So we stood sort of in a corridor there where the elevators were. And then the acting director came out and said, we're not going to let you in, and talked about why. But I gave her a copy of the law that says, under no circumstances can members of Congress be denied access to any ICE facility. And this is talking about not just detention facilities, but
and this is in the law.
Yeah, it's in the law. Plus, the Constitution, requires that we have the power of the purse.
What do you fear is going on there that they're not showing you?
Well, we've got comments and contacts from people who've been housed there and released, complaining about inhumane conditions, like no food, no access to medical care, lack of food, and sleeping on the floors, the whole 9 yards. Bad use of the facility for sure from a humanitarian standpoint, but probably a misuse of the facility anyway. It's just meant to be an office building, and that's how it should be used.
And does this intrude on due process rights or basic constitutional rights, even for those who are in this country without documentation?
Yeah, actually, because the Constitution applies to people even if they aren't citizens or even if they aren't here legally. And so we wanted to make sure that whoever's here is held humanely, but they're the larger due process question as well. So, for example, on the Eastern Shore, I was contacted by the family of a man, a pastor who's been serving out there for 2 decades plus in the Easton area. They picked him up when he was coming out of, I think it was a Walmart or something, detained him in Baltimore. We were contacted. We reached out to the secretary's office immediately, but then they shipped him off to Louisiana, and we're worried about him being fully deported. Now, this is a guy who's raised his kids here, and they've been protests in the Easton area on the Eastern Shore to have him brought back to no avail.
And
so
the evidence is clear that he is not a criminal, has no criminal record.
Certainly not a criminal, no MS-13 ties or anything like that. Pillar of the community, for sure.
And is it your belief, Congressman Ivey, that most of the people in this facility in Baltimore also fall into a similar category of no criminal convictions or charges in the United States, are not public security or national security threats?
For sure. I mean, what it looks like they're doing is basically casting broad sweeps. Anybody that looks like a Latino male, for sure, and of a certain age gets swept up and brought into these facilities. And, in many instances, they're trying to deny them even the opportunity to have bond hearings. So Kilmar Abrego Garcia was taken out of the country and sent to El Salvador, even though there was a court order saying you can't send him to El Salvador, and he was under the jurisdiction of a judge here in the United States already. And we still haven't gotten him back and free all the way here in the United States, even though the Supreme Court said, bring him back and give him his due process. He's still waiting to get the due process on the immigration side.
And you and other Democrats in Congress are suing the administration over this very question. So this is going to get resolved in the court. What the law says and what they're doing is going to be tested.
Well, for sure. I mean, there's a group of House Democrats who've been denied in other places like New York, for example, filed lawsuits yesterday, I believe it was, And I think it's a winner. I mean, we've got constitutional grounds, we've got statutory grounds. The position they've taken is frankly indefensible from a legal reasoning standpoint. So it'll just be a question of time before this gets overturned and we get access to those facilities.
Plenty of Republicans have criticized efforts that you have undertaken as stuntery, as playing games, as interfering with legitimate federal law enforcement procedures.
Well, like I said on Monday, all they had to do was open the door. There would have been no TV cameras or anybody filming anything. We've been doing oversight investigations like this for hundreds of years here in the United States. It's a routine practice. And frankly, if we weren't doing these, the taxpayers should be mad at us because we have an obligation to make sure that their tax dollars are being spent wisely. We can't do that if we don't even go look at the facilities and conduct basic oversight.
Just to clarify something you said, you were not bringing cameras with you. This was not a made-for-television event. You were just trying to see what you could see under the law.
Well, no, we had people with cameras came. The media was there.
Okay.
But the upside on that now is the videotape can be used for court cases going forward. We have an actual record of, and I think solid evidence, of the reasons they gave us for denying us access, and I don't think they have a leg to stand on.
Democratic Maryland Congressman Glenn Ivey, I appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll continue this conversation because it will continue and go on. The family of one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims says they're shocked. Shocked is their word by President Trump's recent comments about their loved one. Their message to Trump about a possible pardon or clemency for Ghislaine Maxwell. That's ahead here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Thanks for hanging out with us. Here is a look at what else we and now you are watching this evening. Florida tonight will execute its 9th death row inmate this year, breaking its previous single-year record. 60-year-old Edward Zakshevsky will be put to death by lethal injection. Zakshevsky was sentenced to death for the 1994 murders of his wife and 2 children. New analysis from CBSNews.com and KFF Health reveals deep DOGE-inflicted cuts to federal support for needy Americans. Since February, more than 700 workers at the Health Resources and Services Administration have been fired. The agency also absorbed a $1.7 billion cut in funding through the president's new tax law. HRSA annually provides more than $12 billion to support community health centers, addiction treatment services, and workforce development. Construction of a new ballroom at the White House will begin in September. The $200 million, 90,000 square foot space will be built where the East Wing sits. President Trump and unnamed donors, the White House said today, will pay for construction, which the White House also said will be finished before Mr. Trump's term ends. The East Room, that now holds significant events, has room for about 200 guests. This new ballroom, we are told, will accommodate some 650 guests. The family of one of the most outspoken Jeffrey Epstein victims is demanding no leniency be shown to Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell's attorney says she is willing to provide information in exchange for a pardon or immunity or some sort of clemency. 2 siblings of Virginia Giuffre and their spouses released a statement reading in part, quote, Ghislaine Maxwell is a monster who deserves to rot in prison for the rest of her life. Giuffre pursued legal actions against Epstein, Maxwell, and Prince Andrew over charges of sexual abuse. She died by suicide earlier this year. Scott McFarland joins me now. Scott, there are those who say the media covers this as kind of a catnip sort of thing, a clickbait thing. We don't do this on this program. Our focus has been and consistently will be on the underlying victims in this matter, and that's where it always will be. And this falls squarely into that category.
And the president addressed Virginia Giuffre again as the evening began. He was asked at a White House event about his comments that she was stolen. Stolen, which is a heck of a word
alarmed the
choice.
family. Like, what are you talking about?
I think that may have been part of what inspired the family to issue this statement, and I suspect we'll hear more from them over the next 24 hours. But in the statement, they really do drill down into the use of the word stolen, saying they were shocked to hear President Trump invoke Virginia and say that he was aware Virginia had been stolen from Mar-a-Lago. And there you see the question they're asking about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's criminal actions and what the president knew about those criminal actions, especially given the president's statement, they say, that Jeffrey, quote, likes women on the younger side. No doubt about it. They joined the group of people, the chorus major, asking for more information. The president's still facing questions about this. This is a fire. If he's trying to extinguish, he seems to be inflaming.
And just remind the audience, Virginia Frey was at Mar-a-Lago, an employee in the spa, as I understand. And then if she was stolen, then that suggests to the family, their alarmed sensibilities, that the president might be signaling he had some knowledge of what the theft by Epstein was about.
When he was asked about it again as the evening began tonight, he said he didn't use the word poaching, but he was indicating there was a taking of workers by Epstein from Mar-a-Lago to work for Epstein. He didn't, when asked if he knew there was criminal activity going on there, again referred back to the poaching issue. But this is going to be the kernel of the issue for the family. That use of the word stolen has quite a pejorative for those who have been the victims of sex trafficking, those who've been the victims of sex abuse. And that continues this conversation for the White House, whether they want to talk about Epstein or not.
And as you mentioned yesterday, in any conversation about Ghislaine Maxwell and her future, clemency or pardon, it is re-traumatizing just the very conversation about it, whether it happens or not.
And not to spread it too wide, but there are experts in this space who say it's traumatizing to any victim of sex trafficking or sex abuse to have the lionization of somebody with 12 years to serve in a prison term for sex trafficking.
Scott McFarland, thank you. As always, I appreciate it. North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs fought for her election win for 6 months after Election Day. She has a stark warning about efforts to throw out ballots and overturn results after the fact. That's next, right here on The Takeout. Welcome back. North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Allison Riggs is warning about threats to your right to vote. That's because she went through a more than 6-month-long legal ordeal over her own election. In 2024, her opponent challenged 68,000 votes. Riggs was eventually certified after a federal court ruled in her favor. I spoke with Justice Riggs yesterday about that, as well as the hot-button issue of redistricting. You have litigation experience generally in the space of mid-session redistricting. Explain to my audience your thoughts about that. I know you can't comment as a member of the North Carolina Supreme Court on what's going on in Texas. I wouldn't ask you to. But in general, this process of politicians trying to find voters as opposed to voters voting for politicians.
So I was a voting rights attorney before I joined the bench. I litigated redistricting cases in Texas and North Carolina under the Voting Rights Act and under the Constitution, under the ideal that the federal Constitution shouldn't let politicians pick their voters. Mid-decade redistricting is particularly concerning because voters expect some sort of norms and to be able to predict who represents them and when. And we used to be in a much more regular cycle of there was a census every 10 years and lines were redrawn and those stuck for another decade.
And you knew who represented you and you knew who to contact for any issue that might arise.
That's right. I worked in redistricting cases and gerrymandering cases where the lines would crisscross across the street, and voters would see yard signs and say, well, that's not who represents me, and be very confused and ultimately concerned. And so the work that I'm doing on the bench as a constitutional officer, but also speaking out on attacks to democracy, it's why I'm speaking at a spotlight forum in front of the U.S. Senate today, is to make sure that people know that these threats to democracy, from gerrymandering to election denialism, these are very real threats. We keep having near misses in terms of constitutional crises, and I just cannot sit by legally or morally and not speak out when that's happening.
Your race in 2024, re-election, was the most litigated and most delayed certification of all the 2024 contests. When you were sworn in afterwards, you said $2 million was spent, time and money was wasted, and irreparable damage was done. Yet you won, you prevailed, the voters' will prevailed. So was that time wasted? Was that money wasted? Was irreparable damage done?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Isn't this how the system is supposed to work? And what I can tell you is I talked to thousands of voters after the election who were so confused. How could their vote for the presidential race count but not the state Supreme Court? How could the rules that they understood them on Election Day be changed after the fact to decide whether or not their votes count? And I cannot give a satisfying answer to those questions. So no, the system is not intended to work this way. The system is designed that when we run for office, we accept that voters might not pick us, but we should, in an orderly, rules-based system, agree to be bound by the outcomes. And it would be tragic if the outcome had been different because I couldn't raise the money that I raised. It shouldn't be who can throw the most money at litigating an election outcome after the fact. That's not how a well-functioning democracy works.
And your race was emblematic of challenges also that surfaced in 2020. And I want my audience to think about this for a second, because you said something that's vitally important that I think gets glossed over. In 2020 and in your election, other races on the ballot were accepted as valid, meaning the procedures were accepted as valid. What was thought to be invalidated was a result within an accepted range of procedures. And that's different than saying there was a fundamental flaw in the process that prevented someone from getting their due process rights or their voting rights processes respected constitutionally.
That's right. This was a selective targeting of a race where disgruntled partisans and disappointed candidates didn't like the outcome in that one race. And I cannot find a way to help explain to voters why it is so that you can just pick and choose which elections you're going to accept the results of, because there is no good explanation.
And in your case, there were questions raised by about a batch of votes that were cast, some by military and some by overseas voters, but those objections were not lodged against a result of any other race on that ballot.
And they weren't lodged against every military voter statewide. It was military voters in 4 heavily Democratic counties. We have 100 counties. So not only was it challenging the rights to vote of people who raised their hand to serve our country bravely, but it was treating those voters differently based on where they registered. And I talked to voters who were deployed in war, were serving in Europe on submarines, on bases in Washington and Kansas. These are folks who were so confused about what they needed to do and if they could even fix it months after the fact. And our service members and their families deserve better than that.
In your history, you also litigated a case involving efforts to make sure that voter rolls are up to date. That often falls under the rubric of election integrity by some who argue in this space. Help my audience understand the necessity of accurate voter rolls, but how litigation there can often create more heat than light.
Yeah. We have been lucky in North Carolina to have a history of great election administration, and I've seen nationally groups do a lot of work to make sure that states are communicating with each other about people moving from state to state. We want our voter registration rolls to be correct, and we don't want any ineligible voters to get pushed off the ballot, pushed off the voter rolls because of an administrative error. In the run-up to my election, we saw pre-election litigation challenging voter rolls in North Carolina because allegedly some voters were missing information like their driver's license or social security number. I'll give you an example because my father was one of those people. He served for 30 years in uniform, was deployed in war. He went to register to vote with his retired military ID. So it obviously doesn't have a driver's license number on it. The DOD decided years ago to take social security numbers off of military IDs for security reasons. Not only did he use a valid form of ID to register to vote, he presented a valid form of ID every time he voted subsequent. So in all of this dispute, my opponent couldn't point to one ineligible voter on the rolls. And this was the pre-litigation, litigation, and post-litigation. And I want people to know that it's not just games. It can't just be gamesmanship. It's people like my father and his right to vote that Those are stories I want to tell so people understand that there aren't credible allegations of serious problems. There's gamesmanship involved.
Member of the North Carolina Supreme Court, Allison Riggs. I appreciate the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Detroit's mayor ditches the Democratic Party as he launches an independent bid to be Michigan's next governor. He joins me next to talk about how that move might be politically paying off. Next, here on The Takeout. Welcome back. This is newsy. A former Democrat turned independent running to be the next governor of Michigan is leading in that race's fundraising battle. Campaign finance reports show Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan has raked in roughly $3.2 million since he announced in December. That's the most in direct contributions of any candidate running to become that battleground state's next governor. I sat down with Mayor Duggan earlier today. Mayor Duggan, it's great to have you with us. First question to you, why did you leave the Democratic Party and how can you possibly win as an independent running for governor?
Well, in 2013, I ran for mayor of Detroit when the city was in bankruptcy and half the street lights were out and there were 47,000 abandoned houses and there hadn't been a white candidate for mayor in 40 years. And everybody said to me, how do you think you can possibly be elected mayor of Detroit? But I sat in people's homes night after night and talked about what I thought we could do together and what would happen if we got rid of us versus them, racially divisive politics. And 12 years later, the city of Detroit's in a dramatically different place. And now I'm going around Michigan saying the same thing. This state is in partisan gridlock. The schools are terrible. The economic situation is deteriorating. The Republicans and Democrats just fighting with each other. I think people are ready for change.
Elon Musk says he's looking for people who work outside the two-party system. Do you want Elon Musk's help?
No, he's trying to form a third party. I'm trying to do something very different. I'm running as an independent because the Republicans and Democrats in Michigan are just fighting nonstop. Last week, the Democrats voted down a bill that would have had school kids not use their cell phones during class, and they voted it down because they didn't like the Republican legislator who sponsored it. I'm trying to get the two parties to work together, and a third party would just add to the chaos. So Elon Musk's third party is not something I'm interested in.
So the Michigan Democratic Party is none too pleased with this effort. You know that better than I do. They denounce you for having a J.P. Morgan executive on behalf of a quote-unquote dark money group supporting you. And they are saying, in part, every day it becomes more clear that Mike Duggan cannot be trusted as the real intentions of his self-serving campaign continue to come to light. How do you respond to that?
Last week's numbers showed I raised more money for Michigan than all three Democratic candidates put together. We had an endorsement of 160 African-American ministers for my campaign, pretty much every prominent minister in southeastern Michigan, which caused the Democratic Party to have major heart failure. And then many of the Democratic unions, the carpenters, the plumbers, the restaurant and casino workers, traditional Democratic groups have all come on board in my campaign. And the Democratic support is crumbling for them. And I know they're a little upset, but people are fed up with this Democratic Party in Michigan. They're just they only care about two things. They hate the Republicans in general, and they hate Donald Trump in particular, and they don't stand for anything else. And a lot of people are deciding they've had enough of it.
Speaking of President Trump, talk to me about tariffs, Michigan, and the automakers, especially as it relates to tariffs currently in Canada and Mexico, which I've read, Mayor Duggan, right now, if they stay, will benefit European Union automakers and the Japanese automakers and the Korean automakers.
Right. Yeah, well, I'm from Detroit. Nobody has to tell us of the devastation from the bad trade agreements over the years. Much of our manufacturing base in Michigan cleared out to Mexico and to some extent to China. So if tariffs were done correctly, particularly for Mexico or China, they could be very helpful to Detroit and Michigan. The Canadian tariffs are a huge problem for us. In Detroit, we have 3 huge assembly plants, 2 Jeep plants, and a GM truck plant. But Canada is right across the river, and the Ontario part suppliers are a huge part of our assembly plant. See, when you put tariffs on Canadian parts, you're putting tariffs on cars from Michigan. And so I'm hoping the president will settle this so we get out of the tariff war with Canada. But I do think the right tariffs in Mexico and China could help us.
In what way, Mayor Duggan? How could they help?
So you've already seen in Detroit, we have brought back major seating plants, dashboard plants, a huge Jeep assembly plant, much of them coming from Mexico. We've become more competitive over the last 10 years. There's probably $6 billion in new plants in Detroit. But the companies are making borderline decisions, but they make decisions 3, 4, 5 years at a time, not 3, 4, 5 weeks at a time. But there are borderline decisions on parts plants in particular, Mexico versus America. And anytime you're into America, Michigan is going to compete. So a good tariff plan could work for us.
Mayor Duggan, you've outlined some of your grievances with the Democrats in Michigan. Do you have grievances with Republicans in Michigan? And how would your agenda differ from what you've seen from Republicans?
There's no question about it. The Republicans and Democrats both share the blame. 60% of the 4th graders in the state of Michigan do not read at grade level. Michigan is 44th in America in our 8-year-olds reading, and that's just unthinkable for a state that used to pride itself on our education system. But a big part of it is every 2 years, this is what happens when you're in a purple state. Republican and Democratic control of the House and the Senate switch back and forth, and every time they do, they pass a different curriculum, a different set of grading the schools, and it's created absolute chaos in our education system. And what I'm looking to do is pull together a plan that brings the Republicans and Democrats in a room and says, let's have our educators design a plan where we teach phonics, where we have small group settings, where we have tutors, and let's not change the curriculum for 5 years. The two parties need to get together and develop some real plans and stop fighting with each other.
Last question before I let you go, Mayor Duggan. I hope we'll have another conversation as this continues. I watched the governorship of Governor Ventura in Minnesota and Governor Schwarzenegger in California, both independents whose victories shook up the system quite clearly. But over time, within a year or two, maybe 3, but certainly within 3 years, if not faster, both parties came together and said, if this independent governor really succeeds, we are signing our own political death warrant. And so they crossed ideological lines to basically do in these independently elected governors. Do you have any fear of that happening to you if you prevail in Michigan next year?
And I would say to you, Angus King in Maine was so successful, he got reelected for a second term in a landslide. And so I'm not going to compare myself to anybody individually, but if you look at what happened in the city of Detroit when I ran, the city was devastated with black versus white, city versus suburban politics. In 12 years, I have not vetoed a single action of Detroit City Council. I built the partnerships and we solved the problems. And I'm confident. You know, I come from a family where my father was a federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan. I wasn't afraid to go home for Thanksgiving. We thought it was fun to debate politics, and we didn't dislike each other. And I really think we're going to get back to that in Michigan.
Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan, I appreciate the time, sir. Good luck.
Thank you, Major.
That's it for the Takeout today. Please tune in tomorrow for my conversation with Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin. Stick around. The Daily Report is coming up next right here on CBS News.